So the next of these videos I wanted to look at, we're going to be looking at the practice of fasting and of abstinences. Um, and I just wanted to say real quick that this is a practice that I struggled on where to put it. I wasn't sure if I should put it here with these practices of simplicity, because obviously fasting has a lot to do with kind of our inner stance and our connection with God, but it's also very closely tied with prayer. So it probably could have gone in that section as well. So just a kind of a quick disclaimer as well. We as Americans have really messy relationships with our own bodies. We kind of have this love-hate thing. We're very, very indulgent with our bodies, and yet we kind of hate our bodies. There's things we don't like about it. We sometimes will starve our bodies, trying to control our bodies, and yet, like I said, we're also very indulgent in the ways we eat and don't sleep enough. And so fasting can get very tied up very quickly with that messy relationship, that kind of love-hate relationship many of us have with our bodies. And so we have to be really careful when we are fasting. We are, in fact, doing it for spiritual purposes. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a second here. Just kind of, I think we need a disclaimer to say that we really have to be careful of our motives and how we're understanding fasting as a spiritual practice rather than like a dieting practice or, some of the other things we use the word fast for. So fasting as a definition is simply not eating food. We use the word very loosely, like when people are saying I'm on a bread fast or I'm fasting from TV. But technically, when we are not eating something else or simplifying our diets, those are in fact abstinences, not a fast. And I would say that that's important because we tend to blunt, I think, both the discomfort that comes with actual fasting, and I think we also tend to blunt some of the effectiveness when we are calling other things fasts. So again, a technical definition for fasting is simply not eating food, any food, if it's a complete fast. And then if we're giving up other things, whether it's a specific type of food like sugar or richer foods, I would say that those are actually abstinences or staying back from other practices. So fasting itself is a practice that, as I said earlier, is tied very closely biblically in prayer. It's also a practice that is tied very closely in response, and I will acknowledge I stole this insight from the writer Scott McKnight. He points out that biblically, yes, prayer is always involved in fasting, but fasting is almost always a response to something. It's either a response to a national crisis, a personal crisis, a strong feeling that things aren't right, or a desire to hear from God, a desire for direction. And I think that that's important because in some circles, fasting and prayer has kind of become almost a bargaining chip with God. It's something that, if I'm fasting about it and praying, it means I really mean it. It means God has to answer me. God has to give me an answer. And God does not ever have to give us an answer. I personally believe he always does, and that often no or, wait are very common answers. But I think there are certain circles that approach, okay, if I'm fasting, it means I'm really serious. I'm really going to impress God. And it kind of forces his hand. So let's kind of do away with that nonsense. I think that there's also a piece of fasting which is reminding us, as Jesus said when he was fasting and was tempted by the devil, that fasting is to remind us that we do not ultimately rely on bread alone, on food alone. We are not just physical beings, but we are physical beings. And so we can't just keep prayer in our heads, in our voices and our talking. I think we are bodily beings, and fasting is a way of bodily praying. And so what a fast actually is, like I said, simply skipping food for a certain amount of time in response to something going on, and for the purpose of focusing on God, of listening better, of hearing better, of focusing our own prayer. So if you haven't experienced fasting before, it's very weird. I'm rotten at fasting. I get very, very grumpy. which tells me I should probably be doing it a little bit more, because really our bodies can go quite a bit less food than most of us actually have. And again, I think we have to be very careful in saying fasting is not ultimately about our weight. It's not ultimately about showing our control of our body. It is not the same thing as either dieting or as anorexia or those types of eating disorders where we are not eating out of a self-loathing or a desire to show control. Fasting is something we do to sharpen our ability to hear God in response to something else. So fasting, when you're first experimenting with it and working on it, it's suggested by people much wiser than me that we simply skip a meal. Don't snack between, don't prepare ourselves, don't overload the meal before. Just do our normal eating routines, just cut out a meal. Cut out a meal in response to a situation going on in your life or the life of the community, something that you want to use to focus on prayer. And then as your body gets more and more used to fasting, skipping meals on a regular basis, you start to cut out more and more. And so the traditional fasts for most Christian communities, for most of history, which we've largely lost as Americans, were Wednesdays and Fridays. There's kind of an elaborate history of where those days came from and how they tended to be practiced is people would skip eating from, I guess it would be Tuesday and Thursday night, that meal. They would just simply not eat food again until dinner on Wednesday or Friday. So it'd be a full almost 24 hours of fast for the sake of connecting with God, for the sake of responding to needs in the community and needs of people. I think for those of us in the American church, I would love to see us get to that point where we trust God, at that point where we desire to hear from God to the point. I'm not anywhere close to that personally. But that is a lifetime goal of mine. It's something I want to work towards. I want to be able to know God and hear God a little bit better through fasting. Now, there are also much longer fasts that people have taken. Obviously, I think 40 days like Jesus fasts and others like it. I know those are still practiced by people. But fasts like that are ones that I think you have to do your homework for. You really have to know what you're doing. There's some fascinating studies on physically what is happening to you, as well as spiritually what you can gain from fasting. But those are, I think, for people as they've been practicing and studying for a long time. So I would also encourage you, if you are interested in fasting, to start talking with other people that you know and trust, to help you think through what fasting actually looks like, what hearing God actually looks like through fasting. Another practice that's very similar and often gets confused with fasting is the idea of an abstinence. An abstinence is when we give up something, usually something good, like I'm not going to, lose my temper in traffic today is not an abstinence. You're not supposed to be doing that anyway, right? An abstinence is giving up something that you enjoy, that is good, whether it's a specific type of food or an activity. Again, watching TV is a very common one. And you give that up because you recognize it has control of you in some way. It has a hold on you because God wants us to enjoy things without them owning us. So anytime we see a habit that we can't do without, that might be something God is inviting us into a fast for. God does not want us to be captive to the things we enjoy. He wants us to be able to enjoy them and also to do without them. So that's a very common practice for Lent. A lot of people will give something up specifically so they can focus differently. So again, if you want to do that with people, don't just do it because you feel a little bit addicted. Do it because you want to connect with God and you recognize that whatever it is you enjoy about that activity or that food is ultimately something that is meant to be done in God's presence. So again, fasting is not eating any food for a period of time. Abstinence is giving up another activity or a specific type of food. And I just wanted to end this video with a little bit of another disclaimer and just saying both fasting and abstinences can often be very public acts. because if we're doing them for any length of time, we will probably run into a situation where we cannot partake in something with someone else. And so we have to be really careful about them, that we are doing them for the right reasons. We're not doing them for attention. We have to be very careful not to be obnoxious about it either, because both of those practices historically have had a little of a tendency to slip into pride, and have had a tendency to slip into kind of an asceticism where we stop liking our bodies. We stop thinking that food and enjoying things is a good thing. But if we're being honest, we as consumeristic Americans, probably not many of us are going to fall into those traps. So we should probably be practicing fasting and abstinences more often, to free ourselves from the many, many gifts we have given, to recognize them as the gifts that they are.